Hello, hello. It's Dr. Mandy, and I'm back after having a baby. I'm back to do my podcast. It's been 8 months, and I'm ready to get this going. And I'm really excited, actually, to have one of my first podcast guests this year, Monique Attinger, my good friend, the Low-Ox coach. And we've been working together in the past. And I'm bringing her on to talk about some new topics on oxalates and seeing what she's got cooked up for us. So let me give you a quick background about Monique. So she is a registered holistic nutritional consultant. She specializes in lowering oxalate and optimizing your health. And those of you who don't know what oxalates are, don't worry, we're going to get into that today. She is a former project manager and IT professional and changed her career after experiencing the powerful effects of changing her diet. Yes, so it is definitely something that you should think about if you haven't done so yet, because it's not a one size fits all. It is definitely personalized, and it's about finding what's best for you and your unique health needs. So she gives you tools, food lists, supplement suggestions, recipes, and menu plans that make change practical and manageable. And please don't rely on ChatGPT for any of this, because what she has in her head, ChatGPT does not know. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well, because that's one area that I think some people think that ChatGPT tells them everything, but no, we know more than ChatGPT does. So change your diet and change your health. That's her slogan, and I completely agree with that. So welcome. Good to see
Thanks for
you
having me,
again.
Mandy. Great to
Yes.
see you. Glad that you're doing so well and that you have a new little one.
Yeah,
Congratulations.
what'd you say?
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been, and I got a new haircut too. Um, the mom do. Well, we're gonna really get into something that might be new to some of the listeners, especially the fertility people who I'm starting to get in front of. I don't think a lot of them are as familiar with oxalates as my IC patients are. So a lot of my IC patients are aware of it because we've been talking about bladder pain, but we will revisit that today a little bit for some of the newbies who haven't yet heard about the connection to bladder pain and oxalates. Sorry, I got to keep changing this camera angle down a little bit here. Okay.
Okay.
Look in the camera. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, those of you who are like, Oxa, what? What are you talking about? All right, let's talk about it. What are oxalates, Monique? Hit it. Tell
Well,
us.
actually, they're a very simple chemical, a couple of carbons, a few oxygen atoms, and who knew they could make so much trouble for us in our bodies? So, why don't I give a little bit of context so that people have kind of a background? Um, Oxalate is something that you generally find in plant foods. You don't generally find it in animal foods. And unfortunately, it is very healthy for plants. It is not necessarily very healthy for us. So plants use it for all kinds of great reasons. They use it to handle oxidative stress situations like tough growing conditions. They use it for enhancing their ability to get the biggest bang for the buck out of sunshine. Like they are doing it for lots of things. Oh, and they're also doing it to defend themselves. So oxalate's toxic enough and damaging enough that plants like spinach are using oxalate to protect them from predation. So when insects try to eat a spinach leaf, that distinctive sort of gritty taste in your teeth, that's actually oxalate crystals, and that will break up the mouth of the insect trying to eat the leaf. So spinach and some other plants have found ways to defend themselves with oxalate. So that's all part of the
I
biochemistry of
used
your
to think
plant.
that was dirt.
No, that's the gritty crystals in the spinach.
Oh my
Yep.
goodness.
Yep. And plants actually also use oxalate to pull up minerals into the structure because oxalate's a mineral chelator. So some people may have heard of that in the context of heavy metals and things like that. Chelation is a way that the plant then is able to get minerals out of the soil. So it's using oxalate to chelate that mineral, bind with it essentially, pull it up into the plant, and then the plant has the metabolic pathways to snip those apart. So it can remove the oxalate from the mineral and then use it. The problem for
Very
us is that we do not have those pathways. So we can't do any or all of those things. And while we do produce a certain amount of oxalate naturally, so people will say to me, well, we produce oxalate, so it must be good for us. No, no, no. Metabolic end product, not recyclable or reusable by our system. It is a mineral chelator. It's going to deplete us of minerals. It's a mitochondrial toxin. That's not a happy thing either. And in fact, oxalate competes with certain nutrients we really do need for uptake into cells. And that's a little bit like trying to use monopoly money to buy something at a store. If a cell pulls up oxalate when it's trying to use something like sulfate or bicarbonate or chloride, it won't be able to do anything with the oxalate. The reason that becomes a problem is that it'll kind of accumulate in the cell. So the cell will choose not to use energy to get rid of the oxalate it just pulled in. The cell transporter essentially drops it, and then the cell uses its energy to send a cell transporter out again to try and get what it wanted, what it needed. And so we can end up with kind of the equivalent of an overflowing garbage can in the corner of your cell that is also toxic, is also binding to minerals, is also driving inflammation. None of these are good things. We do not want this stuff in our cells, but that's where it can end up if we've got too much.
Yeah, so you basically answer the question two and three here about how the body process and eliminate it, and also are they always harmful? Sounds like they pretty much are, correct?
Well, it's a matter of the poisons in the dose. I hate to use that old expression, but a little bit of oxalate, our body knows what to do with because we do produce a certain amount out of our metabolism, and our body knows we need to move that out. The problem is if it's not in the bloodstream, the mechanisms by which the body can move it out are not present. If it's inside the cell, it can be kind of stuck there for a while. So we move it in and out of cells with cell transporters. That takes energy. So the cell's not going to do this process until it's got the energy to do it. And then we move it out of the bloodstream into the kidneys or other pathways to get rid of it by secretion. And that also takes energy. So the body's not going to do that unless it has enough. So because it takes energy to get rid of it, it's not just a passive, simple, oh, it turns up in the bloodstream. It passively diffuses into the kidneys, who passively diffuse it into urine. There's energy expended at every step. And so that can cause us some difficulties in terms of getting rid of it if we're exceeding essentially our bandwidth for how fast we can normally process it.
Okay, great. So let's get into, because you mentioned endogenous and your body produces it. Can you explain the difference between dietary oxalates and the endogenous production, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So dietary oxalates are simple. That's the oxalate that's in the food that you're taking into your body. Could also be the oxalate that's in your supplements you're taking into your body because certain herbal products can also have an awful lot of oxalate in them. And certain kinds of amino acids and other supplements can also have potential for you to create oxalate. So dietary oxalate is the oxalate's already present in the food or in the supplement I take it in. Endogenous oxalate, so just so people don't get alarmed by the term, some people have heard endogenous oxalate in very negative ways. We all produce a certain amount of oxalate, so that's your baseline. The issue with making too much endogenous oxalate is really one of exceeding our ability to handle it. And we do have certain nutrients that can contribute to some of that production. So, high dose vitamin C is one where vitamin C degrades naturally in any environment, the human body or a petri dish, into oxalate. It's non-enzymatic. It's a straight ahead issue of oxidation. So, and we use vitamin C as an antioxidant. Well, as soon as vitamin C has been oxidized 2 times, then you're going to output a molecule of oxalate. And so we think of vitamin C as being a no harm, no fail kind of supplement because it's water soluble and we're just going to get rid of it. But if you're producing oxalate from your vitamin C, that's a problem. The other big potential issue with endogenous production is that if the body's under a lot of oxidative stress, um, dealing with injury or other kinds of issues like infection, we can use up our vitamin B6. And when we don't have enough B6, we can end up producing too much oxalate. And that is enzymatic, and that is through our metabolism. And it's because we will produce glyoxylate out of our metabolism. If you catch that glyoxylate and you recycle it into glycine, no harm, no fail. Everything works the way it should. But if you don't have enough B6, the enzymes that would help to convert that glyoxylate back to glycine are instead not going to be present, and you're going to end up with other enzymes taking over that product, and you're going to end up with oxalate. So AGT, I think, is one of the ones which is implicated there.
Yeah.
I can get more of the details if people are interested, but bottom line, it's a normal process for us to produce some oxalate, but if we are taking in too many of the wrong kinds of amino acids, like certain amino acids are very prone to be uh, converted by our metabolism into oxalate if we have a plethora of them. Unfortunately, glycine is actually one of them. And certain other things that we think of as being very helpful, like hydroxyproline and collagen, can also be metabolized into oxalate. So we kind of have to think about our doses of some of these things and reduce them. But the biggest factor here, by far, is if we're dealing with a lot of stress, oxidative stress, infection, injury, health conditions, which are depleting our B6, we are going to be more likely to produce oxalate endogenously. And that's called secondary hyperoxaluria and is very distinctive from genetic hyperoxaluria, where you would be found when you're much younger. But those of us who have had uh, like large health insults, I'm going to say,
Yeah,
those
it
are
happened to me when I
like,
had COVID. So
yeah,
when I
so
had
you could end
COVID,
up producing.
because
Yeah.
and that's why glutathione saves my life. I always say glutathione saved my life. IV when I was sick because I started to produce oxalates and I went and got measured. I did the NutriVal test, the urine, and oh my God, they were all three markers were off the charts high after COVID, and I had more pain in the body. And then I started doing the IV glutathione. I also did ozone. I think that helps too because it's an antioxidant as well. IV, and that just calmed everything down, so I didn't have as much oxidative stress to to mitigate some of that formation. So yeah, I mean, I firsthand know exactly what you're talking about with
Yeah.
metabolic.
And then if you're taking enough B vitamins, a lot of people are not taking enough
They're
B vitamins.
not. Yeah, I think people with IC are afraid of the B6 a little bit because it can sometimes promote histamine because it's a cofactor for one of the histamine producing enzymes. So some of them who have histamine intolerance, sometimes when they take a little bit too much B6, they take the wrong form of B6 or too much of it, they'll get a flare. So I think that's the fear that they have. So it has to be given to them very slowly. I microdose the B6 with them. Start very
Yeah.
small, pinches. I even tell them open the capsule and just pinch it about half a
Yeah.
pinch at a time. Yeah. Very interesting. So, genetics. Talk about the genetics piece of that, please.
Well, it like at a very high level, genetic hyperoxaluria, you will have certain SNPs that predispose your liver to actually be producing oxalate. And the ones that tend to be found when they're quite young are primary hyperoxaluria 1 and 2. There's another primary hyperoxaluria called 3, which I don't know as much about off the top of my head. But in these cases, you've got genetics that are setting you up to produce more oxalate than the regular human. And because you can start to exceed your body's bandwidth then it starts to accumulate and you start to see it a lot faster because it's not just the diet. You're also making your own. So the diet's just fuel to the fire in that case.
Yes, I agree. Okay, so those people have to be on a uber low oxalate diet for sure.
And if they're at that end, like primary hyperoxaluria 1 or 2, um, very low oxalate diet, very specific supplements, but also those people, in some cases, the only solution is a liver transplant. So they're a whole other ball game.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
let's dive into gut health because I think this is probably a lot of us. So, how does the gut health play a role in how your body metabolizes and excretes oxalates?
Okay. There's a whole bunch of things here, but if we can start with just the assumption that because you're dealing with oxalate from your diet in most cases, for most of us who have been found later on, it's going to be oxalate from our diet. The gut's kind of ground zero because the first tissues that are being exposed to oxalate from the mouth all the way through the alimentary canal are going to be the first ones that are dealing with this exposure to oxalate. And because that's all lined with epithelial cells, and because epithelial cells are, I'm going to say, most likely to have the kinds of cell transporters that actually move oxalate, those are the most likely tissues that are going to have first absorbed oxalate or taken it on inadvertently. Um, the thing about oxalate is you do have more than one form. So we have an insoluble form. That's like calcium oxalate or magnesium oxalate or iron oxalate, even ferrous oxalate, which is calcium oxalate's well known because of kidney stones. So that stuff kind of precipitates out and makes small crystals. And then you have soluble oxalate. Well, that's more easily taken up by the cell, but once it's in the cell, it can irritate the mitochondria, it can set up the inflammasome, it can be doing all kinds of things as well. The problem there is you have like a 1-2 punch to inflammation in the gut because you have the inflammation that can be set up right at the cellular level because the cell has taken up soluble oxalate, and you have the insoluble oxalate, which may be precipitating out even as food is digesting, or may be present in the food, like the calcium oxalate crystals you can feel on your teeth with spinach. And you can imagine that the inside of your gut's kind of being scraped by sandpaper, right? Like a really fine grained sandpaper. So you set yourself up for leaky gut because the lining of the gut's going to get inflamed because of the oxalate biochemically, but it's also going to be inflamed because of the oxalate physically. And that allows for you to be absorbing things that you shouldn't absorb, you don't want to absorb, including oxalate. So that's a real risk. I have a lot of people who think that their leaky gut has some other source and that it has more to do with the bacteria in the gut. And while the bacteria in the gut are relevant, I think people miss this biochemistry and physical insult that oxalate does. But then on top of that, you should have gut bacteria that help. And there are lots of them that do. There's a number of strains of lactobacillus that help. There's a number of strains of bifidobacteria that help. But the big gun that everybody kind of talks about is Oxalobacter formigenes. And that, unfortunately, while it is an excellent bacteria to have in your gut because it's an oxalate obligate, that means all it eats is oxalate. So if you put oxalate in your diet, it's going to be very happy. But the problem is almost everybody in the Western world has had antibiotics at some point in time, and Oxalobacter is very fragile in the face of antibiotics. So most of us don't have it. So between not having enough, I'm going to say natural support from your microbiome to break down and use up oxalate and get it out of the system that way, because they're using it as fuel. And then also the irritation, both biochemically and physically, that oxalate's doing. Yeah, you're set up with a leaky gut, and then more of that's getting into your system with all the downstream problems that come from that.
I remember Susan Owens also saying that oxbacter does not thrive in a high oxalate environment. It actually
It's
thrives better in a lower medium oxalate. So having too much can actually kill it off too. Can you explain that?
I think it's pretty much explained by too much of a good thing, right? They're most creatures, whether you're talking very tiny ones or bigger ones, use nutrients in a sweet spot zone, right? So it's really a too much of a good thing kind of issue then for Oxalobacter. So you do want to be able to feed the healthy gut bacteria, but you still don't want to overdo it. And honestly, I've had clients who tested positive to having Oxalobacter in their gut and still had an oxalate issue because they were just wildly exceeding the capacity of those bacteria to provide support.
I read somewhere that the sequencing for that is not very accurate anyway in the stool tests. Is that
And
true?
I think that's true. I do
Yeah,
think that some
yeah,
of these tests where we still don't have a really good, clear
yeah.
idea. So it's still up for grabs whether or not that client in particular had
Really had it. Yeah, I
oxalobacker
read
or
that.
not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But even on the assumption that she did, um, you can still be wildly exceeding what it can do for you.
yeah. Alrighty, metabolic dysfunction. Okay, the reason I really like this topic is because I'm getting into fertility, and I know that there's a huge link to metabolic dysfunction because some of the fertility clinics, they'll actually put their patients on keto or carnivore and they get pregnant. So that tells you something's going on there metabolically. So I want
Yeah.
to know about metabolic dysfunction and oxalates, about mitochondrial dysfunction and detoxification because they're related and how that's affected. And then let's go also then talk about inflammation too, because obviously that's going to lead to metabolic dysfunction as well. And blood sugar, right? Blood sugar dysregulation is also linked to, oxalate toxicity as well. And that's huge in fertility, huge with fertility treatments, because a lot of times they'll put the patients on, blood sugar medication, and then they get pregnant. So
Yeah. And this is one of those places where um, I think it's like more than one factor contributing to exacerbating a particular aspect. So, because oxalate's making the mitochondria inefficient, it's affecting their function. And because you're getting inflammation set up, because the oxalate that's in a cell can trigger the inflammasome, if you add any other kind of stressor or inflammation or impact to metabolism, you really have, kind of a three-ring circus going on, a perfect storm of things. So we know for sure that oxalate's doing some additional disruption there because kidney stone risk goes up as your metabolic health goes down. So the more dysregulated your blood sugar, the higher your insulin levels, the more likely you have kidney stones too. So there's that piece of it. I do believe that when you get into people who have metabolic dysfunction of that sort, like either metabolic syndrome or prediabetes or whatever, that you also start to see them producing a bit more oxalate endogenously. So that's that whole B6 nutrients, that aspect of it too. And, the challenge is really that oxalate can do so many things. Like, I don't think we've actually talked about kind of the three big ways that it hits us, but biggest by far is going to be depleting your minerals. So, because it's a mineral chelator, almost everybody who's got an oxalate issue is going to be low in magnesium, calcium, iron, zinc, or some combination of, key minerals that are needed in the system. Because when oxalate comes along, it's got a double negative charge. It meets its double positive favorite dance partner. They're going to bind together. And the problem with that is that if that's happening inside the bloodstream, you're no longer going to get the use of that mineral anymore. We don't know. The human body doesn't have the metabolic pathways, is how I should say it, to cleave oxalate away from a mineral. So when the kidneys get rid of the oxalate, they get rid of the mineral that it came with. So that's a real problem. And that affects metabolic function as well. If you don't have enough magnesium, calcium, cofactors to actually perform the kinds of metabolic pathways that you're trying to, then you're not getting the benefit there. Um, We also have this whole issue of driving inflammation right from inside the cell. So when inflammation is implied or implicated in so many areas of health, if you're driving that inflammation from right inside the cell, if oxalate's turning on the inflammasome, that's working against you as well. And then places where oxalate can be in fluids where it can precipitate out, you can end up with physical damage. And they have found oxalate in all kinds of places in the human body. But from a fertility standpoint, I would be concerned, especially with women, for breasts, because microcalcifications in breasts are often calcium oxalate. And anytime you have epithelial cells secretion and the ability to hold something, you could have oxalate precipitating out and causing irritation. And that could even include in the vesicles and the testes. So there's so many places here where it could apply. And I'm definitely looking into where these cell transporters that tend to move oxalate, which are the SLC26 family of cell transporters, where they are located. And from the standpoint of, uh, you know, interstitial cystitis clients that you've worked with, like those cell transporters are expressed on the inside of the bladder lining. But I suspect that once we look a little deeper, we may find those same cell transporters are inside the lining of the uterus. And then we've got multiple ways that oxalate can
I think we
disrupt.
found our paper topic.
We might just
I think
have.
that's it right there. SLC 26. Yeah, and it's
It's a whole
impacting.
family of cell transporters throughout the entire body. So the problem with oxalate is that we really haven't looked at where it could be going. But if we start following the trail of where those cell transporters are, we may find all kinds of things.
Well, one of my patients was getting ready to do an IVF. So speaking of IVF, a lot of people think IVF is the solution. And like I said, I've been on these Facebook groups and people are not they're not having success with their transfers. And these are with healthy embryos, like embryos that are euploid and graded properly, and they're just not implanting or they're miscarrying. So that's interesting about the oxalates because I bet you they're probably being told to follow some type of vegan or high oxalate diet to get healthier, and in fact it might be hurting their, and that's so much money that they're throwing away. I mean, you're looking at a minimum of $20,000 per IVF cycle. But what's interesting that you mentioned, because one of my patients, she was getting ready to do an IVF transfer. She had IC and infertility. She was trying to have her third baby. She was 43, and she's actually on my website right now as one of my testimonial videos. She had multiple miscarriages. We put her on the IC diet, which my IC diet is low oxalate, low histamine, and she took some supplements. Found out she had an infection as well, and that we were working towards. And then as she was waiting for the cycle to begin, she conceived naturally. She had a she
Oh,
had a
it's not
baby.
wonderful.
She had her baby. Her baby is he's 2 months younger than Danny. So he's 6 months old now. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
lovely.
Yeah.
Well, and see, here's what I'd say. We don't know very much in the human world. So there's not as much research in the human world, but in the veterinary world, they know that if you put, say, sheep, goats, cattle on high oxalate forage, and these are ruminant animals with the forage-chambered stomachs who are supposed to be able to convert just about anything, but your miscarriage rates will go up. And I don't think it is just the, if you will, then the zygote that is a problem. What if it can't implant because there's a problem with the lining? Or what if the baby's developing naturally, but the mother is eating a high oxalate diet and oxalate gets through the placenta. We do not have a a barrier in the placenta to keep oxalate out of the baby. So we don't know whether or not we've had like a fetal death. So there's research in the veterinary world looking at this because you've got a controlled environment, you've got a test subject who can't complain. But with humans, we don't know, but I'd be very suspicious. What if mom's eating a superfood diet and that's why she's having problems because baby's getting, essentially inundated with oxalate while it's being gestated.
So let's go upstream then from that. How about PCOS and endometriosis? Are they related?
Um, I have not been able to find exactly the same kind of smoking gun with those two, but because PCOS is also related to metabolic syndrome and those kinds of things, I suspect oxalate's working as a disruptive factor there, as opposed to, really some miscarriages could be a primary oxalate event as opposed to a secondary, if you will. And there's been not any real look at endometriosis from the standpoint of oxalate, at least not that I could find. But again, when I went looking at the uterine wall and the existence of SLC26 cell transporters, they are there. So could oxalate be expressed and could it be moved into the uterine environment and the uterine lining? I think yes. So I think the hypothesis should be that this is a possibility as opposed to just assuming that something that's essentially a toxin and in our food is going to be benign just because it doesn't kill us. I mean, I think that would be naive based on what I'm reading so far.
So it sounds like from fertility perspective, there's multiple layers. So if you go upstream, it could affect, how your body produces energy. It can affect hormones, but then it can also affect the formation of the embryo and, the mitochondrial dysfunction. You can have more non-dysfunction and you can have problems with cell division. But then going even further, it may even also affect how that embryo, if it turned out okay, or if they're doing IVF and they have a euploid embryo, it can affect its ability to implant. But then the male, you mentioned the testes. So it's possible it can affect the quality of the sperm.
I think it could, because again, we're looking at a situation where you've got a duct, it's got epithelial lining, and that's where those SLC26 cell transporters tend to be. And interestingly enough, when I went looking to find all the areas in the body where these kinds of cell transporters exist, I found them in the pancreas, I found them in the lungs. Susan Owens from the Triangle Oxalates group has talked a lot about the lungs as another location. They turn up in mucous membranes. Where do you have those? You have them in the sinuses, you have them in the bladder, you have them in you have them in the gut. So there's all kinds of places where oxalate is known, but then there's a whole slew of other areas where we are aware of the presence of some of these cell transporters, but nobody's looking for oxalate being part of what's going on there.
No, they're definitely not.
Yeah.
No. Although, like I said, there's some fertility clinics that do put their patients on carnivore or keto, but not necessarily because of the oxalates, because of the blood sugar. But I guess they're getting that benefit as well because now by going on that, unless the keto is eating lots of nuts, that's the catch.
That's the catch. So you can do an implementation of keto. Like if you're really staying away from processed foods and you're eating a whole food keto, you might do okay with oxalate as long as you're not really focused on things like spinach and almonds and some of the really high oxalate components. But, it might actually be a drop in oxalate from what your diet was before. And of course, you're getting the metabolic support. Carnivore, really, you're nosediving the amount of oxalate you're taking in. Even if you're still using spices and things like that, you're getting a fraction of the oxalate you got before. So I would not be surprised that that's part of the reason why those diets are helpful as well. Not just the metabolic aspect, but also you're lowering this toxin level.
Yeah, CNY is a clinic in New York. That's standard for them. The doctor's there, Dr. Clintz, I think his name is. He's a big carnivore. He's a big muscly guy too. He's
Yep.
he makes and a lot of the women are complaining on the Facebook group about the diet he's making them do. And I'm like, he's doing the right thing because of these people who are listening to him, they're actually conceiving. So
Yep.
alrighty, let's get into the bladder too. I know we're going to revisit that a little bit. Recurrent UTIs and bacterial persistence. So you did talk a little bit about the epithelial lining, so that makes a lot of sense. Would that cause the pain?
It could cause the pain. So you have the physical disruption of microcrystals. So that can absolutely cause the pain. You have the capacity for biochemistry to cause inflammation of that lining, like the actual lining cells themselves. But when I went looking further, thinking, is that all it's doing? Like just sort of being curious. Turns out that it's quite possible with the physical disruption that you're getting a bladder lining that's easier to adhere to. So if you're getting these small cuts and tears because of microcrystals of oxalate, then you've got this bladder lining, which might be much easier for something to adhere to. And then on top of that, biofilm might be able to use oxalate microcrystals that are kind of embedded in the mucus lining as a kind of superstructure to build around. And interestingly enough, this is unrelated to what I read today, but I just thought of this. They've looked at kidney stones, and there's some indication out there that those kidney stones might be calcium oxalate building up around like bacteria or other things kind of acting as seeds. So it could be that you've got this multi-level thing going on again where you have the physical disruption, the biochemical disruption, but then you might have this thing where normal bacteria that would be present and would otherwise be non-harmful might have these small oxalate shells that kind of build up around them, and then they become part of a superstructure to maintain a biofilm, even when, theoretically you should have killed everything off. But if you've got this little bit of bacteria that's inside like a calcium oxalate shell of some kind, then maybe that's reseeding it.
Yeah, I had seen that in some papers about bacteria hanging around the stones. I don't remember where I read that, but I definitely have read that. And it's interesting because I was just trying to remember why I was looking at that. Because there could be something that's also going on when people go on antimicrobials, and let's say there is some oxalate crystals in the urine, and sometimes they'll have like a reinfection or something like that. I've had it where they'll take a biofilm disruptor. I've seen that where someone will take a biofilm disruptor and then they'll get an infection at the end of that. It's almost like they're breaking up the bacteria that's all. I mean, because if you look at the structure of a biofilm, which is very similar to what's on your teeth, the plaque is a biofilm. There's lots of stuff there. There's
Yep.
fibrin. There's, that has a matrix that keeps it together. And so, yeah, I guess oxalate would be part of that because don't some of these bacteria actually consume oxalate?
I
Like E.
don't know so
coli?
much that they consume oxalate, but the
Okay.
problem is that if you've got something like insoluble oxalate, like calcium oxalate, it's looking, so to speak, to precipitate out of a liquid, right? So if it's got something that it could precipitate onto, that's what's most likely going to happen. And so I suspect that you just have this situation where you have and this could maybe go in both directions because you can get very spiky. Kidney stones are very irregularly shaped. There's lots of little nooks and crannies, so bacteria could adhere to that. But you also have this insoluble crystal, which is microcrystal, and it's it could be seeded by something, right? Like when you have insoluble compounds in still in solution, if you give them something to adhere to, they come out a lot more quickly.
Interesting. Wow. Well, okay, that's a lot to unpack there. So some of the people who are new to this are probably like head spinning. So
Yes, they
let's
could be.
let's go into a little bit of strategies here. Just keep it general, like how you work with your clients. Diet. So I would say there's going to be some diet. There's going to be some restoration of metabolic health, right? Oxidative stress is
Yep.
obviously on the plate because that's what I do too. Like I have to make sure that they're, because most of the people who come to me are high oxidative stress. They're depleted in glutathione and a lot of their antioxidants. They're nutrient depleted. The hair tissue mineral analysis, that's how I determined that. And then what else? And then a lot of them are on a high oxalate diet. So there's multiple things that are going on. So what would you, and you don't have to give everything away, obviously, because you're going to be you work with clients. So you can't just what I'm trying to say is those of you listening, don't take this as a way to take this information and run with it because you could completely make yourself worse. I've told this to people many times. Just because you learned about oxalates doesn't mean that you're going to run and go on a low oxalate diet because there are things that can happen known as
Oxalate dumping.
dumping. Go ahead. Tell us about that.
Well, it like oxalate would be a lot simpler if you slowed down your intake and it started to leave your system and it was in this really predictable level and you could get out in front of it and do all the right things. And Lord help us, it's not like that. So, because oxalate takes energy to move it out of the tissues, what happens is, as you're starting to have less oxalate in the system and tissues start to have more energy, then you get what we call a dump of oxalate out of tissues. And that's basically a whole bunch of oxalate being moved all at once because the tissue is capable of doing that. So then this wave of oxalate hits your bloodstream and then the kidneys and to some extent the intestines. And maybe you've got other backup routes that your body has to use because it's a big wave of oxalate. But all these things will start to hit the bloodstream. And then it's going to take some time for your body to kind of get that out of the bloodstream and get it out of the body. However, oxalate's pro-inflammatory, it chelates things, it has all these functions, and it gets one more kick of the can after it's been dumped out of tissues and into the bloodstream to do some more stuff. So most people will find that their symptoms kind of look like this. They go a big wave and then they come down, and they go in a big wave and then they come down. They go in a big wave and they go. And that's really indicative of how oxalate is leaving your system. And then your system has a bunch of work it has to do in order to cope with that. So generally speaking, um, that's probably the most complicated piece of the puzzle. But what I would want people to understand is your first job, probably over and above everything else, is to take mineral supplementation, get minerals in your diet. You might even want to do that before you start to reduce oxalate because you want to make sure the body's really replete in minerals
Thank
before
you.
you get started.
That's why everyone does the HTMA and they get the Vicon because
Yeah.
those are the first things we do all the time. And you're singing it. Repeat that one more time.
One more time for those in the back.
Yes.
Minerals first. Yeah, it because it's so important. Your body has to be really replete. When that wave of oxalate hits, you want your body to be able to handle it with as much efficiency, and I'm going to say as much grace as possible, so that least amount of symptoms and things get kicked up. Um, you really want to start looking at very much at your B vitamin levels and antioxidant levels because oxalate is pro-oxidative. So again, you want to be very replete in antioxidants. Um, Things like glutathione are great. That's our master antioxidant, but there's other things that I sometimes get people on, like CoQ10 or vitamin E, or things which also help your body to do things like recycle your vitamin C. So as vitamin C is being oxidized, that you catch it and recycle it back to its proper level to be effective. Um, and then nutrient density, like get as much nutrient density into that diet as possible because you've got all kinds of work that's waiting for you. It's right now stored in your cells, but you're going to have to deal with that. So I very often will ask people to increase their protein intake because they're going to need to rebuild tissues that are very inflamed or damaged potentially. And you know, all of that takes a little bit of nuance, but that's kind of the general playing field. Get the body as stable and as well functioning as possible and be slowly bringing down oxalate kind of after you've at least dealt with that mineral aspect. And when it comes to lowering oxalate, I've had clients who are taking in 4,000 milligrams of oxalate a day, which is eye-watering.
From what food? Eating a
This
lot
was
of.
somebody doing an AIP paleo approach, and they were just totally focused on all of the big high guys. spinach, beets, sweet potato, quinoa, teff, buckwheat for their
Ugh.
grains. Like, they were just at these really high levels. They were eating things like star fruit and rhubarb and
Well, listen, that
almonds.
you caught me on that that buckwheat because I was reading watching a webinar from IFM and he was talking about that other what kind of buckwheat that was. I forget what it was, but I sent it back because he was talking it's a GLP-1 agonist. So I was like, oh, GLP-1, I gotta lose weight. So I didn't even think, and so let me just check with Monique. And boom, you're right. I looked it up. That was a high oxalate grain. Threw that
Yeah,
right in the garbage. I sent that right back to Amazon.
yeah, quick. Yeah.
Buckwheat.
So
Wow.
so many of these
They think are
really
healthy. The health.
exactly. So people are trying to eat a really healthy diet because they can feel they don't feel optimal. And then it turns out that what they're doing is adding this toxin to their environment. So I usually suggest to people that they come down slowly. There's various ways to do that, but if you're eating a really high oxalate food and you eat it very intermittently, let's say something like spinach, maybe you have it once every 2 or 3 weeks. Just drop it. Like, you can stop cold on something where you're not eating it daily. The danger is when you're eating something daily and then you stop cold. So my concern for people who go carnivore in particular is that if you nosedive your oxalate intake, your body goes, oh, wow, there's no oxalate coming in here anymore. We can start to move this stuff. But you can have very aggressive movement of oxalate out of the tissues. And in much the same way that you want to go really slowly with things like heavy metal detox because of the toxicity of a heavy metal, you want to go slowly with oxalate because of the toxicity of the oxalate, particularly at high amounts. And unfortunately, it can be affecting you kind of system wide. So head to toes, you can have things that are going on with oxalate.
Great advice. Yes. So this is not a easy thing. Like, because I had somebody say, I'm just gonna go on a low oxalate diet. I was like, oh my gosh, no, don't just do that. Yeah, you have to build the resilience first. Build the
Absolutely.
resilience first. Exactly. Because you don't want to be falling flat on your face because you might have done something too quickly. Well, this is really good. Thank you so much for coming today. It was such a pleasure. And I think we have our paper topic, or we have something to look into. So those transporters, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really big thing because that's giving us, I'm going to say, a breadcrumb trail for where oxalate could be impacting, the function of your body.
Yeah.
And we haven't looked at that because the world has assumed that unless you had kidney stones, oxalate wasn't a deal.
Right.
And and that is, I think, completely ignorant of the fact that, and I mean ignorant in its original sense, which is not paying attention, not recognizing, not knowing. And it's a toxin. So why would we think it's somehow okay to take in a toxin in high amounts and somehow that, as long as I don't have kidney stones, it doesn't matter? Like, I just find it funny because people will say to me, when can I eat high oxalate foods again? And I'll go, never.
Right.
Like, and why would you want to? Like,
Right.
I've had clients go through heavy metal toxicity
Yeah.
issues. And in
Yeah.
some cases, they got it from very ordinary foods, like things like rice, which turns out to have been grown in conditions where sometimes it can be picking up heavy metals
Yeah.
or,
Arsenic.
yeah. So once you're free of arsenic, would you ever deliberately go back and eat foods with arsenic in it? And the answer is no. And so I think the same answer exists with oxalate.
Oh, people love their food.
They
Well,
do.
great. This is awesome. So where can people find you?
If people want to find me, I am on social media. So Low Ox Coach is my typical handle, although on X I am Ox Coach 1 because I had the Low Ox Coach handle and then somehow um, lost track of the email address it was hooked to, and X won't give it back to me. So
What?
yeah, so I'm Low Ox Coach 1 there.
Did you lose all your
Um,
followers or did they end up following you there?
Oh no, they all followed me on the new
Okay,
one.
good, good.
Yeah.
Lost Coach one.
Low-Ox Coach number one.
One.
Yeah.
You are the only one.
Um, I am the only one. And I also have a website, lowoxcoach.com. And for those who are dealing with some really significant issues where they have histamine issues or they have like MCAS type symptoms or things like that, there is indication that oxalate is playing in those areas as well, as you know too, Mandy, because
Yep.
we've done low oxalate, low histamine coaching before.
Yep.
So, yeah, there is hope because people like Mandy and I, we recovered. Yeah,
Yes. Well, this
yeah.
was awesome. Thank you so much. And we're going to do this again, of course, in the future. And we still have to do our ChatGPT
Take down.
meeting. We'll do that in the future.
I took down perplexity today.
Yeah.
I was doing some stuff on like, sometimes AI can be fun as an
Yeah.
initial foray into a topic. And there it was telling me some stuff and I went, no, that's not how it works. It was trying to tell me that something about vitamin C and oxalate and that it was an enzymatic process. And I went, it's not an enzymatic
Oh,
process.
wow.
It's the regular degradation. And then it
Uh,
backtracked itself.
it
Uh,
does backtrack itself a lot. Yeah, it says, "Oh, sorry, you are correct." Seriously? You're supposed to be perfect.
Yeah, it was pretty
Right.
funny. It didn't do quite the amount of groveling that ChatGPT does, but it did all of a sudden decide that oxalate is a degradation pathway, not an enzymatic conversion. And I
Oh,
went,
man.
okay.
Yeah, I've never heard of perplexity. That's a different one.
It's supposed to be more oriented towards health
Oh,
and biochemistry and yeah, I was really surprised. Here's me taking down an AI on something as simple as how vitamin C degrades into oxalate.
wow. You stumped it.
It did.